Now, in writing this, I already knew that this was going to be one of those videos that caused a lot of people to rage and unsubscribe before they even listen to what I have to say. But I do want to be clear that I loved Breath of the Wild, and I especially loved Mario Odyssey. In fact, those two games were neck and neck for my Game of the Year 2017. Both games were phenomenal and nailed different aspects of a similar formula. For this video, I want to talk about decisions that Insomniac made with Spider-Man PS4, another game with a pretty similar formula, that in hindsight, I wish Nintendo made more of. Zelda is great at facilitating exploration and experimentation. Mario is pure mechanical bliss, but neither, I would say, nails both of these things. I'd say Spider-Man manages to, and to be clear, I don't think Spider-Man reaches the heights that either of these two games reach in different aspects. It definitely is not as polished as they are. It's not really a master at anything like those two games are, but it's certainly a better jack of all trades in my opinion, and it does a few things really well that the other two games don't even attempt to do, which I think that's just as valuable. But before I go into that, first, some context. This past weekend, I did a few things I don't do very often. The first of which being, well, I turned on my PlayStation 4. For context, I've owned a PS4 since the release of Bloodborne, another game I love. But outside of that game and a few other exceptions, it's pretty rare for a game on PlayStation 4 to catch my attention. For the most part, games developed by PlayStation's worldwide studios are more focused on the story side of things, something that I'm not really huge on, so those games don't typically interest me very much. I don't mind it, but if that's the major draw to the game, chances are I'm not interested. Of course, there are exceptions to any rule both on my end and on Sony's end with games like Horizon Zero Dawn and the aforementioned Bloodborne. I've dabbled in those few exceptions, but none have scratched the itch for the games I crave, quite like the recently released Marvel Spider-Man. This game prompted me to do another thing I do maybe 2 times a year, being set aside a block of time to play through it completely uninterrupted by anything else because I was completely enamored with the minute-to-minute gameplay. That's the first thing that stuck out to me, and it also stuck out to me while I was playing through Mario Odyssey as well. The game is just pure fun to control. The act of movement, something that most games treat as a means to an end, is a major factor in my enjoyment of this game. And that is a really powerful tool when talking about open world games or sandbox games because, well, you're going to have to traverse the world a lot. And while the sheer awe effect will make you want to push through on foot to take the scenic route, you will almost always hit that point where fast travel becomes your best friend due to the game's world losing its luster and or traversal becoming a chore. The difference here with Spider-Man though was that it never feels tedious for me. It can in other games, even Mario with Odyssey. I can't remember feeling a burning desire to learn what was around a given corner. I progressed because the minute-to-minute gameplay was great, and as I was learning Mario's abilities, just running, rolling, and jumping to the next destination was fun enough. The destination didn't matter as much as getting there did. That said, the movement in Mario Odyssey had its limits for me. It eventually came to a point where I would see getting to the point on the map as a chore that luckily was made less tedious by way of fast traveling. I've never felt the desire to fast travel in Spider-Man, even if my destination was on the complete other end of the game's version of Manhattan. And for context, this isn't a time spent apples to oranges situation. I played Odyssey for around 40 hours, which admittedly I could easily double and enjoy every second of it. The amount of time out of those hours that I spent with Mario Odyssey that it took me to grow tired of traversal in that game was about the halfway point. I used Cappy's ability to fast travel way before finishing the main story. In contrast, I still haven't fast traveled in Spider-Man, and I don't plan to throughout the rest of my time with the game. I'm 80% through completing that game. To be fair, Breath of the Wild, for my first 20 hours or so, I didn't touch fast travel either, but for a different reason entirely. For me, Breath of the Wild never felt fun per se to get around. The fun came from the experimentation brought about by the combat and the mystery box nature of that game's world. Also, I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy climbing in this game, but again, this isn't necessarily fun because of the climbing itself. What makes climbing great in that game, I feel, is figuring out how to get to the top of any given landmass despite not having a lot of stamina. It's a bit of a puzzle. Beyond every vista, there's something of interest to engage with. The act of getting there, though, is, like I said, most games handle movement, a means to an end. Of course, there's things like shield surfing, which can be a lot of fun depending on where you are in the world, and riding on horseback as well as other animals, but those all lose their luster eventually as well. And while I'm focusing on Breath of the Wild, I have to mention the combat. The dynamic nature of combat in Breath of the Wild was a major part of my experience in that game. I always wanted to see the most creative way possible to defeat a certain enemy. This was very true in Spider-Man thanks to its various weapon abilities, but most importantly for me, how webs play into all of that. I love the feeling of incapacitating enemies by webbing them up to the environment, or using webs to perform environmental attacks, or using those webs to position enemies where you want them to be in battle, as well as the small touch that is the web bomb thing that Spider-Man attaches to enemies you knock off skyscrapers. Most of them are definitely dead, or at best, irreparably maimed, but I'm gonna give Spidey an A for effort. And unlike Zelda, experimentation in combat feels very natural. You definitely need to approach combat in a very particular way to make use of those abilities. And Spider-Man is very fluid and flows very well with what is natural in combat already. I say all of that to say, I think Spider-Man benefits from what makes both Mario and Zelda great. It both feels incredibly satisfying to control, and the places that control takes you to are rewards in and of themselves. Exploring this game was a different type of experience because I wasn't discovering a completely new world. I was exploring a place that I've already spent a good amount of time with in the real world. Of course, a game being set in Manhattan isn't exactly new, but looking at this game as a whole picture, it's the first one where I wanted to go around exploring the map to look for familiar sights and differences with the real thing. This game pushes you to find these locales in a similar way to that of Mario and Zelda. And to be fair, it's a pretty standard sandbox game thing to do. Assign quests that facilitates the discovery of the places of interest in the game. The things you find, though, felt more rewarding to me than finding a major portion of the moons in Mario Odyssey, the shrines in Breath of the Wild, and definitely more satisfying than the Korok seeds. Things like the backpacks scattered around the city in Marvel's Spider-Man all serve as ways to establish the history of the world, and makes the world feel like somewhere that was happening without you being there. Something Mario didn't even bother to establish, and something I feel Zelda, while it had similar environmental storytelling, it didn't do a good job at gamifying getting to that lore. And while I'm on the subject of story, I mentioned in my previous video how I feel about Nintendo's game stories. They're fine, but they're nothing special to write home about. And to be fair, it's hard to get me invested in any story in any medium, with gaming in particular being especially difficult. I need to be enjoying the gameplay thoroughly first and foremost, and then from there I need to care about the characters. If I care about the characters enough, then I'm all in on the story. I love the characters in Mario. I can't say the lore of their world excites me at all, because it's usually pretty one note. And again, Breath of the Wild is stronger in this area, but the way the story is told left me wishing they went for a more structured way to tell the story. With Spider-Man, I cared about everything Peter Parker, and as a result, Spider-Man had going on. All of the intertwining relationships had me invested, and while a lot of what the game sets up as twists were telegraphed, they still hit due in large parts of the performances from the voice actors, but also because that's always the most important thing in a Spider-Man story. The events that unfold are always a result of Peter Parker's decisions impacting his life as Spider-Man, and vice versa. And his game did a great job at crafting a narrative that took advantage of that dichotomy. The story mattered. The story in those games served a purpose that stories typically do in Nintendo games. They contextualize who you are and why you're doing what you're doing. Nothing more. You likely aren't playing those games with bated breath at all times trying to figure out what's going to happen. With Spider-Man, you likely are. Of course, nothing is perfect. Spider-Man suffers from a fair amount of technical flaws that I've experienced with climbing up buildings, weird pacing issues with the various character changes throughout the game, button prompts not registering a few times throughout my playthrough, and some pretty annoying insta-fail stealth missions. But ultimately, its highs overshadow its lows. That being said, I'm not trying to say Spider-Man puts the other two games to shame or anything like that. Spider-Man just made some decisions that landed with me in a way that the other games I talked about didn't. They have their strengths, of course, but the combination of strengths and weaknesses in Spider-Man gelled with me in a way that those games never really managed to, which isn't exactly to say this game is better, just different. Like I said at the top of the video, Spider-Man isn't exactly a master at anything, but for me, it's good enough at all of the right things. But those are my thoughts. What do you think about Spider-Man PS4? Do you think Marvel Games would work with Nintendo to bring something similar to the Switch? Maybe an Iron Man game? Maybe developed by Retro? I don't know, just throwing out ideas. For the comment challenge, what are your top 3 games of this year so far? Let me know that and more in the comments down below. Did you enjoy this video? Click the like button and share it with a friend that has a Switch and a PS4 and maybe has a thing or two to say about this comparison. Consider becoming a channel member at gaming.youtube.com/fanatixfour for exclusive emotes and loyalty badges, gaming time with us, and free Switch keys from time to time. But if you aren't willing or able to support us financially, maybe just join our Discord. But most importantly, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell for more videos like this every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Podcast every Saturday, different channel, linked in the description. Okay, that's it for me. See you next week.